All right, everybody. Well, welcome to our first podcast ever. This is Crossing the Firewall, brought to you by the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training at Michigan State University. This is a really exciting opportunity for us to all get to sit down and talk about issues related to cybercrime and cybersecurity and how everyone puts that into practice, whether you're a parent or a law enforcement agent or a teacher or whatever it is. So I'm Tom Holt. I'm a professor here in the school, and I'm also the director of the center, but I'm here with my two colleagues as well, and I'll let you introduce yourselves.
I'm Rachel McNeely. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice, and I'm a center associate for the Center of Cybercrime Investigation and Training.
And I'm Taylor Fisher. I'm a postdoc here at MSU along with the center as well.
Now, we're all professors, we're all smarty pantses, and we're all social scientists. And that's part of what I think makes this so interesting, is it gives us the ability to talk about the things that we know, but also learn a lot from people who work in other spaces. I'm not a law enforcement practitioner. I'm not a cybersecurity engineer. So that's kind of what we're here to do, is to learn from other people, share our expertise, and learn a lot from everybody else. So what made you guys interested in cybercrime to begin with?
Well, honestly, it was just growing so fast. I felt like every day there was a new story about something cyber, and there were no real resources to go to. And so over time, I found myself having these questions that weren't being answered. There was no literature to answer it. And so that's kind of how I got to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I always knew I wanted to do criminology, and that's just because I watched a lot of CSI growing up. So kind of the classic pathway. But then the more that I looked at cyber, I realized how much of those behaviors were either carrying over or being changed. And cybersecurity, right, sits squarely in tech for the most part. And so I think I became really intrigued by the fact that behavior comes through still, and behavior is kind of the king in these things. And there's a distinct, gap between what we know about infrastructure and the technology and how that's influencing, changing, modifying behavior. So I wanted to know more about that. Still looking.
Same. I feel like I've been doing that for 20 years now. And it's kind of improving, but you're right. There's still so much that we don't know. And there's so many new things all the time that it's hard to keep track of it all, really.
So how did you get into cyber 20 years ago?
Well, I thought I want to study burglary and robbery when I do my PhD. And then it turned out to be kind of dull, which I know is not polite or the right way to say it. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same thing. It's just entry into a home, entry into a car. And the offense itself doesn't really change. But with cyber, it's always something different. But there's, analogs to what we see in some respects too. And that was really interesting to me, is how does that connection point, the human part of it, work in a very digital environment? So thinking about computer hacking in 2003, boy, it's not how we think about it now. And so it was interesting and a really fascinating angle for me. I always liked video games and stuff like that, but I wasn't a computer programmer and I have no technical background. But it's surprising how much you can learn on your own and how much you can pick up.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things I always try and plant my flag on, is I'm not a computer scientist personally.
Yeah.
I know enough to make it through, but it's more so the behavioral part. But there are so many analogs, and you try and map on, cybercrime offenses onto traditional offenses. And there are some really nice straight lines, but then there are some that just go around, right? So can we still apply what we already know? Do we need to change what we already know? It's the, new wine in old bottles argument. So I find that really interesting all the time.
Absolutely.
So on that note, the point of the podcast, we're not going to focus on any one kind of crime. Yes, we talk about the firewall, but that's really any number of different things. So our focus is going to be on any kind of cybercrime and all the cybersecurity issues that come around it. So if you're interested in these topics, hopefully you're going to find this to be a real fun podcast series as we move forward. But what's the main thing that you're interested in when we talk about cybercrime? What's your area of real interest?
For me, I think it's understanding whether people act differently online than they would otherwise, right? And if you want to get real crimmy, generality of offending, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in a practical sense, that can be really useful for designing infrastructure based on, a long history of study into human behavior. So that's for me what I'm constantly thinking about.
Yeah. For me, I'm kind of the opposite. I kind of, because of our background with the behavioral side and the social science, right? I feel like I'm trained to always think about behavior first. But there were so many questions that I had about cyber that had those technical components that you do have to teach yourself. And I'm not getting these courses on computer science in my criminology degree. And so I did have to go out and learn those things on my own and kind of learn the tech side of it. And I think that's where I lay in cyber, is more of that middle ground between the cybersecurity, the tech, the ones and zeros, right? And the behavior as well. I feel like I kind of, between the two of us, we kind of balance nicely.
Yeah. And you've done a lot of that, I will say. I think more so than a lot of people in this space that come from the social science background. And I think we've noticed, right, that you kind of run into people being like, that's very technical, that's very computery, right? And so it's hard to marry those two fields and sciences in a way that makes sense to your audience sometimes.
Well, and it's hilarious too, because we do it every day. Everyone has a phone. Everyone has a smartphone in their hand. Like we interact with technology so regularly that there is some level of acceptance, right? We've talked about like the acceptance model where it's just in our life now. But yet we still have these individuals, like you were saying, that are like, oh no, computers, I can't handle that. I don't understand it. It's like, but you do. You do it every day, right? It's just taking one more step to understand what's going on behind that interface.
Well, and now I know people have talked a lot about people who are introduced to especially Chromebooks in school, right? Aren't familiar with file systems or kind of the background infrastructure of how computers work. So I think we have this generational divide that we've talked about forever, but I don't think it's necessarily in the same direction as we've always talked about it, where I think there's kind of a curvilinear relationship between knowledge about computers and ability to use them. Whereas, those are two very different things, right? You can interact, you can sit there with an interface without really understanding what's going on under the hood.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's a huge kind of gap as well that's coming out.
That to me is really the biggest problem moving forward, is going to be that lack of understanding and the absolute acceptance, if not dependence, on the technology itself. Like our 10-year-old was just in a play at school and they all wrote it themselves, but it turns out ChatGPT actually wrote it with them giving it prompts. And if that's the level of engagement that they have with technology, where no, just do this for me, well, then we're not talking at all about what cybercrime was like back in the 80s or the 90s. It's going to be its own weird thing that looks so different from what we're used to. And that to me is really the crux of what is it going to look like and how do we get there? Because things are crazy. It doesn't really make sense how just even in 1 week, a new AI tool comes out, so everyone has lost their mind and the US AI industry is over, apparently.
Okay. Yeah.
I've seen varying takes.
Well, and I think, I know we've talked about this before, but that the kind of bridging the gap of technical skills is so generational, but also the privacy side of it. It's I grew up with Facebook, as my main source of social media and had no idea that all these silly things that I was putting all my information out there was just feeding my data into somebody that could be coming after me using it. And I didn't know, right? None of us knew. And so I think, the technical side of it is so important, just to keep kids up, keep, young adults in the field and relevant to the technologies that they need, but also learning to keep your data private. Don't give out all this information. It's bad enough that so much of our life is in our devices, but the more you give, the more regularly you'd be targeted.
Well, and thinking about analog, so growing up when I was finally allowed to have social media, I was a pretty sheltered child, let us say. My parents were absolutely adamant about not sharing things, right? But when you're young, you kind of see it as this boogeyman that exists outside your understanding. Kind of like when it's like, if you're walking down the sidewalk and you see a strange person, cross the road, yell for someone. It's this like abstract boogeyman, right? However, I think it's much, much more likely for something to happen with your information online than necessarily the boogeyman outside actually snatching you, not to say it doesn't happen, but in terms of frequency, what we're seeing, right? So how do we kind of get around that idea of it's this abstract thing that won't actually happen to you, this kind of overconfidence about your actual risk, which is a classic criminology question. So
So on that note, thinking about the boogeyman and the terror of what's out there online, one of the biggest things that gets a lot of attention is the issue of child sexual exploitation and interpersonal cybercrime, thinking about bullying, stalking, harassment, all of that. What's your take on what our real big threat is? What do you guys think the kind of impending interpersonal offense issue is?
I mean, it purely depends on how you define threat, right? If we're talking in terms of financial, right, you have romance scams that are straight up playing on people's, ever eroding connections to other human beings, right? But in terms of harm and traumatic events, it's almost two completely different conversations that are the two sides of the same coin, but it's hard to categorize. And you're talking about fundamentally different approaches, impacts, victims when we talk about things that are pretty commonly grouped together, right? So
yeah, no, I think, and especially I'm not a parent, you're a parent, you're not a parent, right? And so thinking about, how my child or the child I'm responsible for, if I'm babysitting or whatever, right? How they're using that device and how they're interacting with these things, and how I, as a guardian or potential guardian, play a role in that, because I might be thinking, hey, my credit card's linked to that iPad that my kid's playing with. Let me make sure they don't get on Roblox and spend $1 million, right? But that's only my perspective. I'm not thinking about, hey, maybe my kid is interacting with somebody that they shouldn't be, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's also the perspective of who is that guardian and how are they guarding it? Are they more worried about their child getting interacting with people that they shouldn't be, learning things they shouldn't be learning about at their age? Or is it more that financial concern? I think both are very important conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like harm to the self and harm to others, exactly. And how you're evaluating risk.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is an excellent opportunity to bring in our guest. So we have our first guest ever with us, and it is Dr. Karen Holt, who is also an assistant professor here in the School of Criminal Justice. Karen, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm so excited to be here. Thank you. I'm very honored to be the first guest. As Tom said, I'm an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice, and my research focuses on sexual offending. And it's funny because I've always really pushed back against the idea that I study anything related to cybercrime. I was like, no, I don't study cybercrime. I study sexual offending. And then it was almost, and I'm not sure why that was, right? But now, overwhelmingly, what we're seeing is that it's not just offline offending versus online offending, right? That we're seeing that there's now a mix of both of those things. And so often you'll have in-person contact offending that has some kind of a cyber element. And so it's been interesting kind of watching what I'm studying change over time as technology has transformed the way we interact with one another.
So how did you get into, I know you don't call it cyber research, but how did you get into this area?
Well, I always wanted to be Clarice Starling. That's kind of how I got into studying. My background was in psychology. I started off in psychology and did, my undergrad and master's degree in forensic psych, and then decided I was really more interested in studying criminal behavior. And so, and with sexual offending, I was trying really hard to study homicide. I was always trying to study homicide and kept somehow getting pulled back into studying sexual offending, whether it was through professors that I was working with were saying, we're actually going to do this project instead, or hey, I had this project and it's related to sexual offending. And I thought that was, I've always been interested in human behavior and deviant human behavior and criminal human behavior. So, it was, and the homicide that I was interested in sometimes had a sexual element. So, I had been kind of examining that. But then I kind of exclusively started looking at sexual crime, and it's just been that way ever since.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So.
Well, as you mentioned, things changing with cyber almost being a modality of offending for that. Is that kind of how you see the role of technology in what you study? Is it's just a different way to do more of the same things?
That's really interesting. I do see it as it's a different way to do more of the same things. But then I also think of it as, for example, talking about youth, right? And how, it's so interesting to me to think about how different their experiences are now in terms of social development. I was talking to a younger person who was a 13-year-old the other day who was talking about their they have a boyfriend, and this boyfriend, they've been together for 2 months, and that's like a really big deal. And I said, well, what do you like to do with one another? And they were like, well, we don't hang out in person. And I was like, what do you mean you don't hang out in person? They're like, no, well, we FaceTime sometimes after school, but we mainly just use Snapchat. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating because it's so different than what I had experienced, right? And so just being in the field of sexual abuse and working with, I work with a children's advocacy center here in Lansing, Small Talk, we'll give them a shout out. But the youth, now the youth, I sound really old. What the kids are up to now. But like the way that they interact with one another has changed, and it's such a different landscape, right? And so I initially really just thought of it as people using this new thing to do the same old things that they were doing. And then now when I'm looking at specifically youth or sextortion, it's like, wow, they communicate and they develop these social competencies in such a different way than we did prior to the internet, that now, I don't know, it's interesting to me just to think about how this has become so normal for them, right? Like the idea, let's like take sexting, for example, right? Like there was this huge scare among grown-ups, right? Like because it was like, oh my gosh, this terrible like criminal behavior. And then when you're talking to youth, it's very normative. They expect that a lot of their sex are going to be disseminated, right? It's kind of like it's just really interesting to come at it, and think about how people who have grown up with these technologies, how they frame their chances of victimization or even definitions of victimization. So
you mentioned sextortion. Explain that for people who don't know what that term means.
Sure. So sextortion is basically, so it's a sexual extortion, right? And so it's just basically the threat to disseminate images, sexually explicit images, if you don't comply with the offender's demands. And so sometimes, somebody might say, hey, you gave me this picture consensually, but now, if you don't give me money or you don't meet up with me or you don't continue our relationship, I'm going to send this to all of this picture, these images, videos, whatever it is, to everyone on your friends list or all of your family, and it's going to ruin your life. And so sextortion is this broad term, and there can be different types of offenders. So it might happen between two people who know one another. It might happen between someone who's an adult online posing as a minor and a minor, right, that they've been catfishing. It can also be part of like transnational cybercrime. So it's almost like a business for some offenders where they just kind of throw out emails saying like, we have compromised your account and we have pictures of you, and if you don't send us money, we're going to distribute them and ruin your life. So it's a broad term for an offense that has different motivations and different types of individuals who target victims. But the main element is that it's the threat. So it creates the sense of uncertainty for victims that can be, it's just all devastating. And in that uncertainty of not knowing whether they have the pictures or they've distributed them or they're going to distribute them, it just creates this sense of fear and terror for the victims. And it's a really devastating crime, and one that has been increasing over the past couple of years. So
I think, one great example that's coming from Michigan, since we're centered here, is, I think it was 2022, I believe. There's a sextortion case with a young man who ended up committing suicide because of these threats. So, to that case and to cases like it, how do you see, from your perspective, from your research, right? How are we bridging that gap of interacting with technology and not treating it as this sort of cyber entity that doesn't influence these other crimes? How do you see us kind of getting at, how do we use this as a tool, but not allow it to further expose us?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. I think there are a couple things here. Like the first thing is, my soapbox is always, we need education and prevention, right? And so one of the things, is I did not realize that districts can kind of make their own choices about curriculum and in terms of sex ed or, and so I think they have to kind of cover, HIV and kind of HIV health stuff, but they don't necessarily have to do much beyond that. It's kind of, they have the discretion to make those decisions. And so one of the things that that I read recently that I think is great, that's really good advice, is that we have to stop thinking of sex ed as being separate from cybersecurity, like security and
like online security.
Yeah, thank you. Like online safety,
Mhm.
because there is so much, like there's this, they're not two separate things anymore, right? And especially if you think about the ways, again, that youth interact with one another in terms of intimate relationships or, or social, just all of that occurs online now. And so we're really encouraging people, I forget where I read this, some article, to stop thinking about them as separate and to really start to talk about, okay, yeah, we need to discuss when you're in a relationship with someone, what does that look like? What are they going to ask you for? What are the risks of sending these images or sharing intimate things? And then what are the responsibilities if someone shares those with you? And another thing too is thinking about like bystander intervention too, because, a lot of kids, there are a lot of motives for why people send sex or disseminate sex, or non-consensually disseminate sex. But for a lot of kids, they report that it's funny, or it's just to them, like they don't see it as being it's funny, it's about status, right? And so I think it's important to talk to kids about like the responsibilities that you have if someone sends you something that wasn't intended for you, right? And just how harmful that can be. So I think we really need to create, like, again, like here we're gonna do this thing about online safety and online bullying, right? And then here's your sex ed that's just, I think we need to change our messaging, because it's not I think we're failing to really give them realistic information. And just another thing is that you talked about the boogeyman outside, or like that stranger, or even like the online predator, right? And so much of like online, like the sexual exploitation occurs between people that know one another, right? And I think it's just like like the offline sexual crime, right? Where we were always focused on the stranger rapist, or the stuff that statistically was less likely to happen to us, right? Like because nobody wants to think like, oh, the people who love us the most or that we're closest to are the ones we need to worry the most about, right? So, and I think that's really big too when it comes to educating kids about sexual exploitation online, is like you are more likely, right, to be harmed by someone that you have some kind of existing relationship with, right? Like, so, a lot of the sextortion, so Dr. Liggett O'Malley, who was one of our graduate students and who is now at USF, we did some research and we found that a lot of times in intimate partners, right, they experience sextortion from their partner, right? We used to call that like revenge porn, when they would just kind of distribute it. But we found a lot of them are actually engaging in sextortion behaviors where they're using stuff that was images given to them consensually to then threaten their ex-partner and to try to make their lives miserable and to ruin their lives or to get them to come back or for whatever reason. And so I think it's important to remember, that there certainly strangers do target, right, people online, so children online, but I think we can get so focused on that outside, and then we miss that, it's usually like it could be another kid in their class, or it's somebody that they know, or it's a trusted adult, or it's someone that they met on Roblox, right? So I think we need to really, it's hard because nobody wants to face a lot of these facts. I think it's really, it can be really kind of a dark place to think about all of the people we know and love are the ones that are most likely to harm us. But we have to have some conversations, some uncomfortable conversations. And I think that's the only way that we're going to really kind of help to protect, especially, our most vulnerable populations. When I think about the kid in Michigan and just how, right, like the 17-year-old kid who felt so threatened and so scared and just like his life was over. And I think about, right, like if we can create people and spaces where there's a researcher who calls it being askable, create basically, like the idea that people and kids and vulnerable populations feel like they can come to us and ask questions and come to us for help and remove that shame and stigma from some of the stuff, then I think, that's how we move forward.
How do you do research on a topic like this, given we're talking about a very vulnerable population? It's not something that, cybercrime doesn't get reported all that well in the press unless it's like a data breach. So how do you do research on something like sextortion?
Yeah, so I have to give the credit a lot, to Dr. O'Malley too for the sextortion studies that we've done. She used open source data, but also court records. And so but that's really limiting when you think about like all of the sextortion that exists. So we're looking at the ones that have been reported, B, that have been where someone's been apprehended and then they've been convicted. So most of those cases involve children because they involve that's technically CSAM, right? And
What
so
does that
they're
mean?
child sexually abusive materials. I'm
Thank you.
sorry. So we used to use the term child pornography. We don't use that term anymore because pornography implies consent, right? And kids cannot consent to sexual activity. And so it's just a term that we want to really emphasize the harm and the abusive nature of, right, taking pictures or videos of children. So those cases, so were overrepresented in our sample because those are the ones that are most often going to result in, again, people being apprehended and convicted. And we're really, overly more, I think, more concerned with this idea of child predators, right? And so we used court records and, open source media, but it's difficult, right? I know that some people they've done surveys on Facebook and Instagram, and that we asked adults or emerging adults about their experiences and whether anyone's ever threatened them with, images. But it can be difficult, again, because most people aren't going to report these crimes, right? We know that sexual violence is among the most underreported type of crime, and so it does pose some challenges. So we do the best with what we have, right? And we can only know what we know. But so that's kind of what we've done so far in terms of our sextortion research.
So I have a question for you, because I think to the conversation of the analog versus digital conversation, trying to use what we already have in the crim literature and stuff. One thing that I've noticed from my reading is that online crimes, especially with children, they're a much longer process, right? They're taking a long time, that grooming process that we talk about. So I'll ask you this. Can you talk a little bit about the grooming process and maybe about how that length of time, right, the amount of time that they're having contact with these children or whoever they're trying to groom, how does that change the approach? Because now we have so many contact points. It's not a one-time burglary, a one-time robbery that happens on the street. It's something that's going to happen for a long time. So where are those kind of intervention points maybe that we can look to say, hey, there might be something going on here?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I just have to say, when all of you use the word analog, it takes you a minute to process and be like, wait, analog means not
Yes.
digital,
See,
not-
my apologies.
I was using it to mean a parallel, though, so we're kind of mixing up our terminology. It's all right. Wait, what do you mean? We'll make a code book later for all of our terms.
See, this is why terminology is really important, because meaning is not always.
We
meaning.
both use it correctly, to be fair.
Okay, that's where I was like, wait a minute, but they're conflicting? Okay.
Yeah. But
All right,
it's
let's
just
do cyber versus no. How about that? Like online versus offline. That's probably better.
No, so it's really interesting. Grooming is basically like, it looks like what regular, like, healthy human behavior is supposed to look like, right? Like, it involves gaining trust, it involves building rapport, it involves like all of those things, right? And that's why it's so hard for people to be able to tell, like, is this a relationship? Is this love? Is this whatever? And then only when somebody exploits it and starts to do harm, it's like, oh yeah, this is grooming, right? There are definitely red flags that, and there's a researcher, Elizabeth Jenglig, I'm gonna butcher that name, but she has a really great kind of like a visual that she gives about all of these different grooming behaviors. And so when you're thinking about online abuse and grooming, and you were talking about how it can go on for so long, right? And so when we were looking at some of the sextortion cases, there were cases where, I mean, like, it would be like a year or two that they had contact with these kids, and the kids really believed that they were in a relationship, and that can definitely affect how that impacts them, like, trying to move forward, right? Because if you really believed that this was 15-year-old whoever, and we had this relationship, it's almost like that romance, right? You were talking about romance scams. It's kind of that similar, like, this was somebody that I thought I loved. And but so the grooming process, typically when you're looking at like a crime like sextortion or online sexual abuse, it starts off with, usually these individuals who commit these crimes, they know where kids congregate, right? So they'll go onto like Facebook, and it's not the dark web or anything, right? It's like messaging apps and like Instagram, Facebook Messenger were some of the ones that were being used in our study. But and then they'll make that contact with, it could just be like, hey, I see you like this, or hey, you're cute, or whatever. And then kind of like really just building that rapport, talking about common interests, right? And then eventually kind of introducing the concept of sex in whatever way, right? It might just be maybe they're flattering at first. One of the things that I think can be a red flag is if someone gets sexual very quickly. So in sextortion, that's focused on specifically teen boys, like the one in Michigan, right? What we tell people to look out for is like it is quick, like it is like, so they don't have like usually a long grooming, right? There's like those transnational types of organizations. They'll be like, hey, let's masturbate. Like, they don't say it that way, right? But it's like, let's get down to business, let's do this. But the ones where it's like a long period of time, there was one guy I remember who had kept notes on each child he was talking to, because he had been talking to lots of different kids, and he was trying to keep track of all the conversations, what the kid liked, the kids, the kid was finding, this person has problems with mom and dad, this person, whatever. So it's like, for some individuals, grooming is this thing that like, it's a really long-term process. And in terms of intervention, I think it's hard. I think that's why, again, we need to talk to kids about what do healthy relationships look like, right? If somebody's trying to introduce these sexual concepts, or in a way that seems quick or is making you feel uncomfortable, or they're asking you for these images, or they're asking you to do things that maybe you don't feel comfortable with doing, right? I would say like those are some of the red flags, right? Asking about where your parents are, asking those kinds of questions that, and I think it's easier for us to sit around and talk about like, hey, because I don't think, when you're in that relation, or you think you're in that relationship, or you're having these conversations, I think it's harder for probably people to identify like, hey, this is part. I think it's easier retrospectively to look back and be like, wow, this was grooming, which makes it hard. But I think definitely introducing those sexual ideas, if somebody seems like they're kind of pushing your boundaries, right? Those kinds of things would be, I think, points of intervention where you're like, hey, this person's really pushing or really asking me for content, or just trying to get me to make content of other people, because we know that's happens as well. So those are some things I would think that, could be, if we would talk to our kids about, right, what this stuff looks like, I would say some red flags that maybe then they could, go to a trusted adult and talk about.
So for parents, I would imagine, given the weight of that possibility of something like that happening to your child, if I were in that situation, I'd imagine I'd have the knee-jerk reaction of, you're not going to talk to anyone ever on anything. But research shows that children who are excluded from online socialization actually suffer similar outcomes to children who consume too much of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you think that the balance there should be teaching, kids, adolescents, emerging adults, how to spot that kind of thing, how to, healthily communicate with others, even though you said it typically resembles healthy communication?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's interesting because one of the biggest, there's some research that was talking about like a lot of kids don't want to report when something happens because they're terrified that their parents are going to take their devices away. And that's like their lifeline, right? Like I can't imagine someone taking my phone away, right? Like I wouldn't know what to do. Actually, now I think it'd be kind of a relief just work once. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not getting any of those emails. But when you think about a teenager, right, or like an emerging adult who so much of their life is tied up in like using that technology, right? It's a huge deterrent because they worry like that this is, if they take away my phone, like I'm not going to have that access to like my life anymore, right? And so I think that I think we need to recognize, I think that's hard, right? Because as a parent, you do want to be like, no, you can't have this. Like, I'm taking this away because I want to remove any chance of harm, right? But that's just not the world that we live in. And that's why I think, right, trying to find that balance is extremely hard. Like, and I don't think you find a balance, right? It's like, how do I create this balance? And and sometimes the boundaries are going to shift depending on age or what people need access to, right? But I think it's difficult, but I think, it's just trying to, I don't know, I think it's creating, again, these, like, becoming askable, understanding, and I think that, like, we have to overcome our own barriers, right? Like, and think about, like, consider their world and their views and their feelings and emotions, and have that empathy while also still protecting them and making sure they're not being harmed. And I don't know that anyone's figured that out yet, right? Like, I think it's incredibly difficult, but I think like we need to start moving towards that, right? Because it's not like abstinence only and like taking things away and all of that. We know that that can be incredibly harmful and not really have the consequences, or it can have unintended consequences that can be damaging. That's all to say. I have no idea what you do.
It's all to say emotional work is the ultimate work.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
So you've talked a lot about what parents can do. What would you say is the main takeaway for law enforcement, since you do a lot of work in that space? How do you train, or what's the one thing you would want a police officer to know about sextortion and other kinds of crimes like this?
Yeah, that's really a great question, because I think the law enforcement that I know, and I work with a lot of amazing law enforcement and who have varying levels of knowledge when it comes to this type of crime or online crime. I think one of the biggest things is that, they kind of assume, because they know themselves or they know like each other or their field, they assume that it should be easy for victims to come forward. It's one of the biggest assumptions that I've noticed that police seem to have, or law enforcement, like, well, why wouldn't they come tell me about this? Or like, if someone's being victimized, then they need to go to the police. But I was just watching there was a video this morning. It was an investigation done, I think, by NBC. Where it was like 4% of sex crime is actually like, it results in a conviction. And I don't know, I didn't click, I just saw kind of the headline. And, I know the statistics are, for sexual assault are incredibly low, right? And so when we think about police, right, I think a lot of them, some of them maybe who work specifically in sexual crime or who have that background, maybe understand how difficult it is for victims to come forward, and understand that the culture is kind of stacked against victims, because offenders often are not, like, they can go free and there isn't accountability, and victims can do all the right things and still, right, like the offender for whatever reason goes free, or it takes years and years. So I think law enforcement needs to be able to recognize that it's not easy for victims to come forward. There are a lot of barriers for victims in terms of coming forward. And if they do come forward, how you react to them is incredibly important, right? Because if you're like, well, why would you send this? Or why, like those, just thinking about the language that you use, right? Being victim-centered and trauma-informed is really important, because that reaction is going to either open someone up or it's going to shut them down completely. So I think there are a lot of mixed messages that victims and just the general public and kids get about coming forward, because again, and I think we don't give young people enough credit to, like, they're not dumb, do you know what I mean? And they kind of like know the culture, and they don't think law enforcement's going to do anything, or they don't think law enforcement's going to believe them, or they think law enforcement's going to, like, I know in some cases, right, like if you look at some of the sexual assault kit data, there have been cases where people have been charged with like making a false report because the police didn't believe them. And so I think law enforcement has to remember, right, that these are all the things that victims are considering, right? And they might be scared depending on their identity and lots of different factors, right? If you think about LGBTQ plus individuals who maybe aren't out to family or friends, or going to law enforcement, then, right, is going to be even more difficult. So I would say with law enforcement, it's really understanding the barriers, understanding the shame and stigma that's associated with these types of crimes, and just how hard it is, I think, for victims to even make that call to the police or to walk into, right, the police station. And then I think also, I don't know, with law enforcement too, again, they're reactive, right? Like, they're reacting to these things. And so there's only so much they can do. And I think being honest with victims about some of those limitations also is helpful. Like, just, acknowledging, hey, thank you for coming forward, right? It's important to report, because that helps us know how often this is happening. And even if we can't do something in this case, like, this could like save other people from being victimized, and just kind of emphasizing the stuff that they can do, and focusing on the positives of coming forward. I don't know. Those are just some of the things I think about when I think about law enforcement. Also, law enforcement, I think, have to check their own biases too. Like I think we all do, right? And so just I think doing that work, that's such difficult work. And I think we get into this, they tend to kind of use that like quick decision making sometime. And I think like there are a lot of misconceptions about how victims should act or react or what they should do. And now we know so much about like non-intuitive behaviors and why some victims might act a certain way and other victims might not. And so I think just educating themselves too on some of that. But also with law enforcement, I think like taking care of themselves too, because that's something we don't talk about as much. And it's like, what can, not burning out and not becoming too jaded. And I know it's easy for me as a non-law enforcement person to say, but I think having a good support system and making sure that you're taking care of yourself if you're working in that space, because you're not going to be able to help people in the same way that you would be if you are making sure that you're getting the kind of support that you need as well.
Mm-hmm. So, and with reporting, we know that especially with these crimes that incur intangible harms as opposed to something like financial harm, which is much more likely to be reported. And people are often motivated by this idea that nothing's going to happen anyways. And truthfully, especially for emerging adults, there is this kind of legislative loophole, multiple loopholes really, that we have, because I would argue, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the CSAM legislation in this country is one of the criminal laws with the most teeth by far.
Yeah.
And then you have kind of these state level revenge porn, colloquially non-consensual distribution of intimate images, technically, state laws, right? But so many of them stipulate this motivation, right? It has to be driven by revenge.
Yeah.
And so if you, overlay these laws and you're restricted by what age were you when it happened, can you prove that it happened for this reason? I would imagine a lot of these incidents are going unreported, and if they are reported, not pursued anyways, even if they are, because there's no teeth to go after them with.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent point, right? Like the CSAM stuff, and I think that's why with the sextortion, right? Again, we saw okay, there's overrepresented our sample because there are these loopholes for emerging adults, and like how you mentioned the revenge porn legislation. And Carrie Goldberg is a lawyer. I don't know. Have you guys ever heard of her? She's a lawyer who was a victim of revenge porn and now only focuses on that's her entire practice is helping victims of revenge porn. And she does so much work in terms of going around and trying to get, to talk about the importance of legislation. And it's interesting too, right? Just because I don't remember how many states, we were just looking at this, I don't remember how many states have implemented those types of laws. But just, I think, again, like you were saying, the idea that you have to prove, right? Okay, this person did this because it was revenge, or this, these different elements, right, that have to be there. And then a lot of times these laws don't, I think sometimes they can be more symbolic. A lot of our sex offender legislation generally, I think, is largely symbolic, but doesn't have the intended consequences that we would like it to have. I often wonder what we can do outside of the legal and criminal justice system, the formal systems, to support these victims, informally, from more of a restorative, community-based approach, because so often the system fails us, and it takes so long for the legislation to then catch up with the actual crime that's happening, and by then things have changed, or we've realized, oh wait, maybe we don't that's not what we're seeing, or whatever. So I don't know, and I don't know what you do about all of that, right? Because it's really difficult. And to tell people, please report just so we know, because we want to know that it's happening, is also not really fair to them. Yeah, tell us this happened, but we're not going to do anything about it, or we're going to try, but we probably won't be able to do anything. And I don't know, I feel is that the case generally with a lot of cyber offenses, or do you think that's more focused on the sexual cyber crime?
It depends. Certainly with hacking cases, we're talking about most offenders not even being in the country. So what can you do?
Yeah. And with the fraud side of it too, you get so many cases where, it was only $50 or it was only $20, right? It's the FBI is not going after anyone that's coming after you
Right.
for $20, but it could be that they got $20 from you, $20 from you, $20 from
Yeah.
you. And when you do report it, then we can say, oh, you know what? Those $20 add up to be 100,000.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
a problem. So
So similar to sexual crime then.
yeah, so
Someone
it's
involved.
incredibly difficult to say, well, we are only going to investigate crimes if it's over $200, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's not really fair for me to say, but then also say, like you said, but you should still tell me about it, right? And
Yeah.
especially I would imagine in the interpersonal situation, particularly with kids, asking them to relive all that for no reason,
Mhm.
just not fair of us. It's
Yeah.
not right, especially when we know can't do a lot about it. People are overseas or whatever. So yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky.
Well, and for financial harms, right? Lots of people will report to their credit card company or
Mhm.
a industry third party that can, catalog a report, maybe,
Mhm.
bring back what you've lost, etc. But talking about intangible harms, that doesn't exist for
Right.
intangible harms. There is no
No.
third party that you can go to help remediate what's happened as a
Yeah.
result
Get my
of
trust
that.
back.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, industry and these third party organizations are catching what's falling through the legislative loopholes, I think, for when people lose money or, more clear cut, use that
Yeah.
very loosely, crimes. But I think that just doesn't exist for
Mhm.
these types.
And then when you think about too, because one of the things in our sextortion research that we weren't able to measure is were these photos actually distributed? Unless the offense,
Mhm.
like in some cases, the victims knew because, their family received the images. But that's one of the things I think that's hardest for some of we just did a study of sextortion victims' impact statements, Dr. O'Malley and I, and just reading through, it was just the trauma that these children experienced, right? And then they go around not knowing, are these images still out there? Who has them? Are they going to show up? When are they going to show up? Right? That's just such a hard, like you said, like the intangible harm, right? And not you can't measure that, right? And it doesn't necessarily ever go away. And they talk about to the families, talk about how they go through that same thing. Like they worry about their kids' photos. Where are the kids' photos? And they also talked about, just like with, other sexual assault, like offline sexual assault, they talked about how re-victimizing the criminal justice system, that process was. So then I think even in cases where you report, the police respond, they find the person, right? They convict the person, and those are the minority of cases. But even when all of those things happen, the victims are still reporting that they are so traumatized and then re-traumatized by all of that. And then I go back to wondering, what is the best approach to handling these crimes, right? Like if we know that they're traumatized by nothing being done, then also by something being done, right? Like how do we best respond to them and make sure that they're getting the supports that they need?
Mhm.
It's so hard, right? And we know that kids and victims generally can be resilient, right? And can move on. And but there are a lot of I think but then there are a lot of victims who maybe are more vulnerable, who don't have access to the same resources. And so maybe will struggle more. And so it's really difficult, I think, to think about how do we best respond? Is the criminal justice system response the best one in terms of, if you think about offender accountability, right? But what does that look like? I don't know.
Well, Karen, I know we could keep talking all day about this.
Yeah.
And this has been really insightful. So we appreciate you coming on. Is there anything else that you have for us? Anything last
No.
words?
Oh gosh, that's a lot of pressure to have last word.
And prompt you with core questions. One of the questions we kind of teased as a through line for our episodes was, if you had to leave it on a note, what do you think the average person should know about this phenomenon in general?
Oh boy, that's a good question. So I think the average person should know that we need to be able to talk about sex and sex crimes, that talking about sex generally and about safe, online behavior does not mean that you're promoting it, right? And that we have to have these conversations way sooner than we think we have to have these conversations. And that the best way to prevent harm, right, especially right when we're thinking of sexual harm, is through prevention and education, right? And through really giving our most vulnerable populations the tools that they need in order to protect themselves and to help us protect them.
Well, excellent. That's a great point to end it on. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you the next time we cross the firewall.